So yeah, we did go on a second what we call infrastructure tour. I guess technically it was our third infrastructure tour, but the second one that we've done of the Metrorail. And there were a number of differences between when we did it in 2018 versus when we did it in 2022. Part of it is what you touched on in your presentation, things like the fare gates, and just changes that have been made to the architecture of the system that is clearly not in line with the original vision of the architect. But it's always interesting to see how the artwork dynamically sort of affects the space that you're in, right? And I'm thinking about like coming up from underground at Summer Best, and you see this piece over you, the George Sugarman piece, or parts of it at least, and then it's backlit, right? Because it's like got this glass roof. It's just so, it's really inspiring to be able to come out like after an awful day at work and like you're commuting home, and you come up and you see this. And I say that because I used to have to do that every day. But it's also interesting to see how in some ways the art program has, I don't want to say failed, but hasn't been supported in the way that it needs to be. So if you, in the construction at Allen Station, some of the pieces were removed. The Richard Freeburg piece was actually was scrapped. There's a photograph of it in the exhibition in a scrap pile by the yard and shops, and I'm sure that it was damaged in some way. That was probably very cost prohibitive to fix it, but it's still alive. But it's interesting to see how different pieces of art in the system, you know, clearly they had a particular program in the space in which they were put, like the Scott Burton bronze benches that were there as public seating in Allen Station. Those were removed and brought to Utica, and in the process they were refinished, and you can tell that they were installed in such a way that there wasn't really any concern about whether or not people were going to use it. So there's definitely a lot to think about in terms of how those things relate. And I don't know if there's anything that's coming to mind that you could piggyback on.
Well, when you're talking about those benches, they're really nice. Like, you know, good design, good architecture. It comes from a good client, and you know, in the case of the NFTA today, so you remove those artistic benches, and when you address the very real need for seating in these stations, you take scrap seating from the airport and then plop them in the station. So that I don't think, in terms of however it's run, the NFTA isn't really capable of thinking on that level, being like, we have to get the seating right, it has to be visually compelling, it has to be distinct. That just thinking doesn't exist there right now.
And you see that too at Summer Best. We pointed this out on the tour, and there's a photo of it in your presentation. The outdoor portion of the George Sugarman sculpture, you can see where there's these pits where there used to be landscaping, right? And I've never seen it with landscaping. I've been in Buffalo for 15 years. I've never seen it the way it was intended to be. So I wonder how much of that sort of upkeep and that sort of tending to is necessary in order for us to get the correct sort of effect and like the humanizing element that you would have with this art in these stations. Because you need it with you know, glass and concrete. I happen to love glass and concrete architecture, but for some folks they feel the need to soften it. And so the art is really critical to doing that and making it a space that's for everybody.
And with George's installation, like that also requires like upkeep from people who understand what the point of that was. It is supposed to be actually radical. It is supposed to be a weird, strange place for people to just lose their imaginations in. And I don't get the sense that if those pieces fail, if they fall apart, that they would be replaced with a new artist who has a similarly radical approach to how to landscape, how to create comfort for passengers or people just passing by the property.
Yeah, and I think, you know, if you look at, for instance, in our exhibition, you know, the charting the course from the initial plans and, you know, to today's mind, almost like outlandish visions of what the system could be, and drawing lines to what we have today, that is really a symptom of a larger problem, right? Of public disinvestment in our public goods, right? In our public environments. We know that one of the reasons that the Metrorail was never finished according to its original visions was due in large part to funding and the changes in political winds that caused certain lines to disappear. So saying that as thinking about, again, we have, this supposed renaissance in Buffalo, and we have these, beautiful new totems of what I'm calling like private luxury, and in the meantime, the public realm is falling apart. And, it seems like the only way that the public, any public spaces or public projects can be completed now is by tapping people like Douglas Development, right? So just giving that kind of context, but also thinking about part of it is perhaps just the unpopularity of the station architecture itself, or buildings from that era. As you mentioned, Mark, are old, but not so old that they've come around in the public imagination as being something important or important to preserve. And I know that you've written extensively on this topic and on brutalism, mid-century architecture. I wonder if you can speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, with buildings like the stations or Green Midland Center, anything like that, I think of someone like my dad, who in my mind is like the most level Buffalo guy. He's he saw what happened in the 60s and 70s, and so in his mind, those buildings represent failures. Doesn't matter what they look like. He remembers what he used to look at before, and he remembers the nuances of whatever corruption or just initial plans that weren't realized. So it's hard to get people who I wasn't around for all that. So to me, seeing today's Buffalo, these stations seem like miracles, but to someone who's much older, they just symbolize, oh, this was supposed to be an amazing transit system, and now it's just one line. So when I look at these buildings, I see failures. So I don't know how to really get past that besides just constantly talking about it from my perspective until someone comes around.
Well, that's interesting though, because, I'm also an outsider from Buffalo, right? I'm from the tri-state New York area, so I come here, or I came to Buffalo, and I see things like that building, and to me that's not triumphant, but it certainly isn't a failure, right? And so there's definitely a level of cloudiness from folks that are in Buffalo, have been in Buffalo, have witnessed from the start to the end what was supposed to develop. But I think that for folks that are not necessarily from here, and they say that, with the growth that's happening in our area, it's mostly for people coming in from the outside. And I wonder how much of that sort of ties into the Renaissance story that we hear all the time. Just an aside there.
I wonder, and I think time definitely is a factor. So those of you who followed Museo and some projects we work on will remember the project we did on the shoreline apartments, another kind of example from that era. Unfortunately, that those are no longer mostly, but thinking, for instance, one of the discussions that we had around the shoreline project, an example was Boston City Hall, which was almost universally reviled as a terrible travesty and awful piece of architecture for a long time. I think one of the anecdotes was it was named by some travel website as the ugliest city hall or something like that. And there was this effort by architects and preservationists and community members there to reframe the narrative around the city hall, and like you said, public engagement, public education around the issue, and it did turn public opinion around on Boston City Hall. Today, you will see that being celebrated as a great example of brutalist architecture. And so I will be transparent in saying, in our small way, this is our way of starting to think about how we can use some of these strategies at home, right? And I wanted to follow up on a point you made, Mark, this idea of, best practices, or maybe we can start to think about like what are some solutions, if you will, to this issue, right? To the art, promoting the art, promoting the architecture. You can see in our exhibition, there's a series of reproductions of the station brochures that were created around the system's opening. And there's these amazing documents. They had, these really fun illustrations on the front. They had like cutaway views of the station architecture, as if to be like, don't be afraid of this underground space, like this is how it works. They had images of the art and architecture. So I wanted to maybe shift gears a little bit into that, and then, and then we're happy to, if folks want to jump in with any questions.
Well, I mean, what you were just saying there, it reminded me of just like, the MTA has a social media accounts that are just about their art program. It's a probably the more famous program because it's New York. Also, there's so many stations. But, Buffalo has artists on its Metrorail that MTA also has. So like the Sam Gilliam example, that was a big deal in the art world, I guess. And we had a New York Times obituary and a bunch of art publications, and MTA also had their condolences, and then they showed pictures of their piece at the station. They explained how much they enjoyed working with him and why the piece was special. But Buffalo also has a Sam Gilliam piece on a really cool, distinct building. There's just no mention of it here at all. So it takes the people who own these pieces to be excited about it, to actually care about it, to understand it, and want to share that excitement with the public, because it is for the public anyways.
Are there any questions from folks here? I don't know, Annette, should we have folks speak into the mic to capture this? That, El Museo, we've previously engaged with the NFTA, and a shout out to Helen Chenris, who was here on our own, arts engagement with the system. So we presented a very small project called Your Utica Station, where we installed artworks by 4 local artists in the ad spaces in the station. If you ride the system, you will know that there are a lot of underused ad spaces, and we thought that there was a nice little intervention, right? Instead of passing by some ad for I don't know, do law firms still advertise in some way, but instead of passing some ads, there were these ephemeral pieces of art, and there are a number of other projects that the NFTA has worked on, such as more recently, I forget the name of it. It's like Poetry on the Move.
With Just Buffalo.
Poetry in Motion with Just Buffalo Literary Center. Again, this idea of bringing art that's maybe in more ephemeral form. I think when we think about public art, it's always like, here's a mural, here's another brick wall mural.
You helped with that. Remember, you got us together. So
Yeah.
these discussions are very important.
Yeah, so I think that there's a lot of opportunities to maintain that level of public interest, and we do hope that in some small way that, again, also reflects on what's already there, and perhaps as an impetus to future efforts on their preservation and continuing kind of public education on what already exists. So maybe
reflect on public performance art, in like our metro stations, like the absence of like a busking culture, like within, our public transit. And 2, I was wondering if you could reflect on the bus stops that are like sculptural, that we have like scattered throughout the city.
I haven't seen any of the bus ones, actually. Where are they?
So there's one on Virginia near, I think that's Plymouth, I think it's across the street. There's one at North and Elmwood.
Okay.
It's just like they're scattered throughout the system.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I'd love to, I'll send you like a list.
Okay. Yeah, my takeaway from the bus shelters here is there just aren't even close to enough to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
And then the one I remember in Elmwood was just like a sculptural ad for beer. Like the Shock Top, I think. I forget where in Elmwood that was. Yeah, I don't remember any like architecturally significant one. But the question about bus here is like, I never thought about that here. I've never seen one. It's true. I assume mostly it's just density. Like there's just not enough riders to make it worth your time to bus, Yeah, I can't think of anything else. I never really see, I never see like enforcement, I've never seen an FTA policeman stopping someone.
Right.
That-
Yeah.
that-
Yeah, do you think there's like ways to like design spaces to make it like more like, preferable for busking?
I mean, I know the MTA has a program where they like have artists and they give them a designated space
Mhm.
and they do performance art, where they do music, and that is like, I don't know if it's not really busking, but it creates
Mhm.
I guess a more controlled version of it where riders can, whether or not they're social enough to handle busking, they can enjoy this piece and then get to the train. So I think that's probably a good compromise that a transit authority would want to do, yeah.
Thanks.
Yep.
I think that the bus station, or bus stops that you're referring to are part of the Small Millworks project by Brad Wells.
I believe so. I'm not sure if they all are.
They all are, yeah. But I know more about those. And it's really interesting to see that type of architectural intervention. Although, as far as I know, they're not 100% complete. For example, the one on Porter Avenue near Plans Music Hall, you can see that there's clips to put glass in, but there's no glass there.
There's been some issues.
Yeah, there's been some issues with that, but
I think they had glass and like the glass was like broken
Broken,
at some point, just
yeah.
never repaired.
yeah, and that that's part of like what we are sort of thinking about here. You mentioned the vandalism to some of the pieces in your presentation, and even non-artistic amenities like architectural amenities and things like that are still really at risk. Yeah, so.
Yeah, and I want to also jump in terms of the performance piece. I do recall that Sugar City had put on a really, whirlwind performance tour of the art station, not art stations, the underground stations a number of years back. Unfortunately, I didn't attend that one, but it looked really cool. It would be great to see something like that happening again. I know that, right, currently, especially with the effects of the pandemic and service issues, there's just been relatively very few riders in the system, and in a way it does contribute to some of the, if you want to call, antisocial behaviors that have been happening in terms of like vandalism and upkeep. So it would be, I don't know if you are familiar with that. It had a really cool name, but it's escaping me.
I remember what you're talking about,
Yeah, and with the bus stations, I also, we did propose a project after the Utica station that was more focused on bus stops. Also we want to think about bus riders as not separate, but from the train, but part of the same system. But I think the funder declined that because it was too temporary. They wanted to see something permanent.
And just to touch on the busking piece again, I am not a musician, but if I was a musician, I would not want to busk in a place that has piped in classical music. in a subway station for 20 minutes, and you're by yourself. It can be a little eerie to be down there with.
Urbanism now is multi-story, multi-use, or multi-story mixed-use buildings, regardless of the design. And it seems like in some ways that presents a challenge in and of itself in preserving, the architecture of the stations, which of course involves preserving the art in the stations. If you're doing transit-oriented development around the stations, which, as you showed, is the direction things are going. So I guess I'm wondering if there are any best practices that folks are aware of for trying to maybe incorporate those stations into sort of a better urbanism mix. For example, where you could develop a larger building that might be attached to one of the stations, where the station sort of then serves as, sort of a gateway or an atrium, for a larger building that might be attached to the station, or, different examples like that. If folks have, explored some of those different options or are aware of precedents from other cities where they may have done similar things, And also, I guess with regard to public art, the Albright Knox has recently gotten heavily involved in public art in Buffalo and in Erie County, and they've sort of made that their own. And so I wonder if anyone has tried to, an initiative of getting the Albright Knox to sort of adopt the public art and the Metrorail system as sort of part of their mission or part of their portfolio, because they seem to be good at getting things right, whereas local governments and agencies, not so much.
Yeah, so I wouldn't know how the Albright House would be able to, like, what kind of role they would play or how that works out politically. I'm sure it's possible, I don't know. I can't think of any examples right now of an old station being integrated into a TOD project where the original station is in its pure form and everything's built around it. I can't think of any right now. And then I think the first thing you said was about the expectations of like good urbanism and public architecture. A lot of these stations are in Main Street in general. There's not a lot of super tall buildings, and a lot of these stations are facing other one-story buildings. And in some cases, they're facing like storage facilities, fast food restaurants. These stations are by far the most architecturally serious contributions to the streetscapes for blocks at a time. There are plenty of other small-scale public buildings, libraries, in particular neighborhood libraries, post offices. So I think the scale is fine, and I think if there is some sort of actual renaissance of redevelopment, all of a sudden this high density, the properties all along Main Street can easily handle that without sacrificing these stations.
And I would piggyback on that. The TOD initiatives are important, right? Because we want to have the best buildings that we can and the best development that we can. But when we look at the reality in Buffalo, there's so much empty space in the urban core that, in my mind, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to rip something down that exists and doesn't, maybe it has a little leak or something, but it can be fixed just to replace it with something else. And more recently, I think that the profession, so to speak, has been coming around to that. I read an interview with, and I can't think of his name, but he's the original developer of LEED building certifications, which is an environmental certification. And he has gone on the record as saying that there should be no LEED certifications for any new build building. That at this point, with the environmental situation the way that it is, and things escalating as quickly as they are in terms of climate change, and in terms of waste in architecture, that any LEED certified building should be a repurposing of a building that already exists rather than a new build. So to rip something down that's had, so much energy invested into it, conceptually, but also literally energy, electricity, petroleum, to rip that down just to build something else, when there's so much empty space around it, just seems wildly irresponsible to me.
While these aren't like huge structures, like at my firm, they talk about embodied carbon now, where older buildings, the carbon's built in, so if you demolish it, it immediately becomes extremely wasteful. And so in a case like the stations here, there's just no need to be that environmentally wasteful for a new project.
So I think we'll take one more question.
I wanna go ahead, and I think we can take a few more questions if you all don't mind having a shorter break. I'd hate to cut the discussion short since this is what we're hoping for, right? I would definitely second and third and fourth the points that were made about climate and about building waste. These buildings are literally, in many cases, surrounded by empty space. And to the point about transit-oriented development and these contemporary standards of urbanism, I want to push back on that a little bit, right? This idea that we should all live in blocks of 6-story buildings with street level retail. It's fundamentally a very privatized imagining of what cities should be, right? A store is a private space. A Metrorail station, is a public space. And I think that's a really important distinction if you think about, how spaces are used, how spaces are read by people moving through the city. And I think it's somewhat, very American frame to think like, yeah, retail, stores, that's the ultimate expression of urbanism, is like a cafe that's cool to hang out with. So just, that's kind of my little pushback on that. I think that urbanism works just fine if you have to walk out of your apartment building that's next to the train station and go down the train. So that's the one point I would make. On the public art piece, I'm informed that the Albright Knox currently does handle all the FTA's art commissions, is that right? Yeah. And I also have kind of maybe a little hot take on this, which is that the Albright Knox has been immensely successful in elevating the profile of public art in the city. The Albright Knox is, again, fundamentally, it's a private organization. Yes, it's a nonprofit. Yes, it's publicly funded in part, especially the public art project is funded by the county and the city. But ultimately, this is a private interest. And why should the Albright Knox have a monopoly on all the art in the city? That's just one thing I would say. There are plenty of other arts organizations and plenty of other artists. And I think the solution to this idea that public authorities and governments are not able to handle such projects is to increase their capabilities to do that. Like, we really need a truly public solution. The original Art Transit project was a public project run by a public authority. Yes, private consultants were involved and commissions were involved, but ultimately I think that distinction is really important. Next question.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to the last question about going back to we have to go back to the last century, London, England, but a lot of the underground stations that were built immediately prior to World War I were designed with the intention of allowing future development above. So these were architecturally notable buildings in their own right, typically 2 stories with a flat roof, and the add-on development in many cases didn't occur until the 1950s and 60s. Some examples more sympathetic to the original than the others, but the point is, it's quite possible, but it has to be designed in from the start.
Thank you. Do we have, I see John here? And then maybe after this question we can break.
Not sure I have a question, but I did want to just say, I'm glad you mentioned Shawsky's piece, that's the one that's in the medical station. She's a friend, but and so I was very excited to see the piece. But I had practically the same interaction or first I thought the same thing sort of as you, like the piece is this rippled metal, like it's tactile. I wanted to touch it.
Exactly.
And I actually didn't know that the artist in the summer best actually intended people to climb it or touch it in that way. And so I'm really glad you mentioned it, because I didn't like to. It's interesting to have that historical perspective, given that it is a public system. And then I wanted to say, to add to the lead conversation, you know, these buildings are brutalist, concrete buildings. I love them. The concrete, of course, is one of the most carbon intensive building materials that we have, so like we shouldn't be destroying them. And then the last thing I wanted, I guess there's a question. I'm sorry, but you know, I'm thinking about the expansion of the Metrorail, and I have my own opinions about that because I think that we should be focusing more on creating urban density, as opposed to like reaching out more suburban. But my question would be, in terms of the urban density, you know, when I think of this original line, the stations seem really, except for the above ground ones, they seem really spread out compared to like New York City or other places. I'm curious, like, if y'all know the history of like why they're, like some of them are like, you know, 6 blocks apart, you know. It feels like that's another way to increase density. But I'm just curious, like, what the thought process might have been behind that, if you know it. But, yeah. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Yeah, I don't know the official answer, but I assume part of it's just cost to build more and more stations within those gaps, and like the density of the population wouldn't maybe justify that cost.
That's definitely true. In the research that we did for the exhibition, there were a number of different proposals going up into the late 1970s to move stations around. There were certain stations that were deleted because it was just determined that the cost of building them, there weren't going to be enough passengers. For example, there was a station proposed at the bend at Ferry Street, where at Main and Ferry, but that was eventually deleted because they just thought there were only going to be a few hundred riders boarding and alighting that day. In terms of now, that is extremely difficult. In the way that the system was constructed, there are actually certain areas, for example, the fabled Tonawanda turnout, which was an expansion that was proposed to the Tonawandas. There was additional construction done on the tunnel in order to facilitate that, because they knew that if they were to have that construction, have it link into the main system, that they would have had to close the system for years in order to build that. So they built it in from the start. But anything that they didn't build in from the start would require closing the tunnel, closing the system down, limiting the amount of distance that it runs. And so I'm not really sure that would be possible, to be honest with you.
Another reason for the extended station spacing was to allow faster travel times.
Yeah.
There's a trade-off, right?
Yeah, and the intention
stops
was,
and speed.
the intention never was for the Metrorail to replace the Main Street bus.
Yeah. For the more local service would have still been through the bus system, the feeder bus system, as they call it.
So, yeah, I think, thank you all so much. We had a really robust discussion, and of course we can keep going, but I just want to make sure we're on time. So it's